I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And we are live on location at the Resourcing Tomorrow conference in London, England. And I have England's finest countryman, Ted J. Butler, joining me to talk about his final episode of the Planes, Trains, and Automobiles saga. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you, Mike. I don't know about England's most famous countryman, but I'll certainly take the compliment. It's been a long series, but I've very much enjoyed doing it and looking forward to capping it off today.
Yeah, as we did in the last three episodes, we've been talking about the greening of the transportation, so we went through the planes, we've gone through the trains, the automobiles, but none of that runs without infrastructure.
Right.
And that was the final part that kind of didn't fit into the planes, trains, and automobiles theme, but we needed to discuss that. So this is the infrastructure part of the conversation. And we can't have a green transportation without infrastructure. We need to generate more energy. We need to have the ability to store that energy and get it to the transportation grid where it's needed, when it's needed. What did you find out when you started to explore the infrastructure around the transportation grids?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mike, to make that point about how really infrastructure should be viewed as in its own right, as a category of demand. And perhaps due to the complexity of the drivers that we're dealing with, it's fatally ignored. But essentially, the first thing that I realized is, obviously, in light of the Trump presidency, a lot of the environmentalists were panicking, basically arguing that the whole green energy transition and the infrastructure rollout is going to fall flat on its face in the US. And I want to be quick to provide a bit of a rebuttal to that idea, because quite frankly, with Elon Musk at the helm of the Department of Government Efficiency, as they're novelly calling it, I don't believe that the green energy infrastructure rollout will slow. I actually think it will probably stay the same as what it was originally going to do. You're talking about the CEO of an electric car manufacturer here, who's someone who's been incredibly vocal about the rollout of solar panels. Just recently saying on his Twitter or X now, solar power will be the vast majority of power generation in the future. And that was just in November. So if Musk has the level of responsibility and autonomy over policy that Trump is alluding to, then I actually do believe that green energy infrastructure rollout will be quite robust in the US. And that was the first thing I really understood about this.
Yeah, we've gone through in a full election cycle through this particular series, and the U.S. election happened prior to this last piece done. But in reality, it was probably finished being written before we actually knew who actually won the election. So this is kind of over and above what was in the article. But yeah, like I've looked at it, and my opinion on it personally was that pardon the pun given the topic, but that train had actually left the station, and that we are making a movement towards a green economy. Will it come grinding to a complete halt? I don't think so, but Trump, by his very nature, could make some things a lot more challenging with its rollout. For a prime example is China makes the majority of the solar panels that Elon Musk says is going to be generating the majority of the energy. So Trump tariffs and other, disputes with China, which will probably get escalated once again, although in reality, under the Biden administration, they haven't necessarily de-escalated. You could see bumps in the road where, if we're trying to bring solar over to power the charging stations that are going to power the electric car in a hypothetical loop, can't do that without the solar panels.
Absolutely, and I think this touches on a previous theme that we discussed in a previous podcast about the resurgence of old energy. It's not a question of either or energy source. It's a question of we're going to be using both green and brown energy for the foreseeable future to power the AI rollout, to power the data center constructions, to power the rollout of all this new technological innovation that's being rolled out in the US in particular. I mean, of course, this is not to say that old energy is going to completely take over. But at the same time, you're seeing what Trump's been saying about Anwar in Alaska, the reopening of the oil fields there. You're seeing the Doug Burgum, a very pro oil and gas politician who's coming in to be part of Trump's team. But this is not mutually exclusive. We can have the rollout of green energy infrastructure and the doubling down on what's formerly known as old energy. But of course, the important takeaway here is that even before Trump, the majority of green energy infrastructure rollout was deriving from China and the BRICS. And that's really the key takeaway from this is the continued strength of the Chinese economy will be an important determinant for the continued rollout of green energy infrastructure. And of course, there are some warning signs at the moment in China. Lots of economic stimulus from Xi Jinping and quite a muted response in terms of economic stability. There's not really been much. We're arguably on the brink of a deflationary spiral in China and could be on the brink of the lost decades akin to Japan post 1990. However, the important thing is that Xi Jinping is dependent on these industries to stimulate economic growth. So for the foreseeable future, I do believe that industries like solar, industries like lithium-ion batteries, manufacturing in general in China will be doubled down on, at least until Xi Jinping has no capacity left to do so. And that's good for metals, that's good for critical minerals, that's good for silver, that's good for copper, and it's good for a lot of rare earths as well, which China has a monopoly over.
Yeah, they do. And, Trump's not even president yet. He's president-elect.
Right.
And, we're sitting here in London and I'm reading my news from North America. And the Biden administration, on their way out the doors, decided to put a block on
germanium and gallium.
Well, no, that's
semiconductors. Yeah,
the semiconductors. That's the word I was trying to spit out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And China retaliated by barring germanium and gallium exports into the United States. So that's the kind of tit for tat trade things that are going to, I think, escalate under Trump. And given that the industries are there, Trump is under the belief that the most beautiful word in the world is tariff. I think it's not going to be a tariff for tariff type of trade war. It's going to be, okay, tariffs, we're not going to trade you. You can't have this. More tariffs, okay, you can't have that. And at some point in time, it's going to get down to some of that green technology, the solar panels. We're already seeing bans on Chinese electric cars to come into Europe and North America. I guess really bans is a bad word to use. They're going to be hugely tariffed, making them, unaffordable compared to the domestic production. All of this, I think, is going to put some storm clouds and some blockage up in the system to slow down that green transition. But even without the transportation that we talked about, I had a podcast down in New Orleans with Scott Melby from the Uranium Producers of America. And when we talked way back in May, we were talking AI then. It was another train at the station, but we weren't expecting it to be a bullet train. And AI is moving that power grid needs so rapidly that we may already be behind the curve in that. So is that some of the things that you kind of found, that maybe the transition to AI is going to slow the transition to green transportation because the power is going to be needed for the AI?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that definitely warrants further exploration. One thing I did notice, I've been in Colombia recently, and we talk about the changing dynamics of supply chains, the US-China trade war. China is actually trying to buy the loyalty of certain countries. It's realizing that trading with the US perhaps is going to be a no-go in the years to come. And it's basically investing in the infrastructure in countries like Colombia, where I've been, massive solar parks in Colombia. And the same goes for Latin America in terms of transport infrastructure. China are planning to have a port in Peru. I don't want to go into this too much because I know this is going to be the topic of my next article, but it's interesting to observe that Xi Jinping is not stupid. He knows that he's in for a rough ride with the Trump presidency. And he knows that in order to ensure that China doesn't fall into a deflationary spiral, he's going to have to find new markets to tap into. And I think what we're going to see is really just an increased speed of transition towards this multipolar world, whereby the BRICS countries trade with one another and the US G7 countries trade with each other. I don't think Xi Jinping can afford to waste time. I think he's already aware of the situation. And I just think he's going to try and find new markets ultimately. And if he fails to do so, there are many countries that are already rolling out green infrastructure at an alarming pace already. I think I've mentioned it on a previous podcast, but it's worth mentioning again. Adani Green Energy in India rolled out the world's largest renewable energy plant in 5 times the size of Paris. We're talking about 500 kilometers squared capacity. It's mostly solar. It's supposed to expand every year by 5 gigawatts. And then if that fails, you've got Brazil, which reached a record solar capacity in 2023, said to be boosted further by the displacement of government-run auction schemes by free market-based bilateral agreements. And here, around 65% of solar capacity is in the pre-construction phase. So once that's completed, we could see silver, in particular, become a beneficiary of what Reuters say will be a 5-fold increase in Latin America's solar capacity. So there are plenty of drivers for the rollout of green energy infrastructure. And the world, by virtue of Jevons paradox, which is an interesting economic concept, will need more energy as countries industrialize, regardless of what happens with the US-China trade war.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just to illustrate how far behind America actually is, in California, they had a heat spell this summer and they asked people to unplug their electric cars so that they could run their air conditioners. So we're already behind in having ample infrastructure, be it green or otherwise, to power the needs of the green transportation that's already there.
Well, let me give you some color on that as well. So you talk about the US being miles behind. You're absolutely right. China hosts approximately 2.7 million publicly accessible electric vehicle chargers, which is about 70% of the world's 3.9 million public EV chargers as of 2023. On the other hand, the US has a very meager second place, 140,000 slow chargers, 43,000 fast chargers, relative to the 2.7 million of China. It's not even close. So this is the important takeaway, is that China up to now has been the absolute determinant, the dominant determinant of green energy infrastructure rollout. And I think it's going to remain that way. I think the US, well, I don't think it's going to remain such a lead. I think the US will reduce the deficit slightly, but either way, there's going to be more green energy infrastructure rollout. It's not going away anytime soon. The conference we're at has been renamed Resourcing Tomorrow to illustrate this. And we can talk about the pace of it, the realistic targets. The IEA, obviously one of the major organizations rolling out the targets and the timelines. And quite frankly, I do believe they're over optimistic. I do think it's not going to happen that quickly. But the appetite for energy to fuel these endeavors that are being rolled out is going to require a lot of green energy infrastructure.
Yeah, and the lack of infrastructure is actually holding back a lot of the transportation transition, because if you take a look at the automobile and the truck industry, the number one consumer concern is range. And, where I live, as an example, I live on Prince Edward Island. It's a small island. One of my neighbors is a realtor. He owns an electric vehicle. It's fine for the island. Oh, yeah. He can go tip to tip on the island. He has lots of range. His problem is the moment he leaves the island, he's screwed because he doesn't know where the chargers are. They're not readily accessible. He has to really plan his travel, time to be able to go from point A to point B and make sure he's still got a charge for the vehicle. And a lot of consumers, at least in North America, are somewhat accustomed to the convenience of having a gas station everywhere. And as a result, they don't want to buy an electric vehicle because this is a major concern. So, in the scope of our discussions, is it a chicken or an egg? Do we need more electric cars to get more charging stations, or do we need more charging stations to encourage people to get more electric cars?
That's a really great question. I actually think that it's more to do with the infrastructure coming first to actually demonstrate to the potential purchasers of electric cars that it's feasible and that there are ample charging stations available to, combat that problem of range and charging accessibility. So I think, the infrastructure must come first, but that's going to be costly for governments, which isn't going to help the government debt situation. That's probably going to be good for gold as we talk about the macro situation there. But I do think, as much as I do believe that the green energy transition will slowly happen, like I say, the projections from the IEA, I think, are overly optimistic. But if we just listen to them and take their word for it, they expect that there'll be 23 or 24 million public chargers, electric vehicle chargers globally by 2035. In that sense, we would be needing somewhere in the region of a six-fold increase from 2023's total of 3.9 million public chargers. So realistically there, we're talking about 6 times increases in 11 years practically. And I don't think that is quite feasible. But even if we get halfway there, we'll be talking about a lot of consumption in copper. If we actually just take those estimates for what they are, copper consumption for public EV charging infrastructure could be as low as 187,000 metric tons in 2035 or as high as 585,000 metric tons. Just to give some context, this is about half the annual production of the Escondida mine in Chile, which is the world's largest copper mine, approximately producing just over 1 million metric tons in 2024. So, of course, even if we don't reach the levels of those estimates, the level of copper and silver in particular that are going to be consumed by this rollout will be astronomical, and it will exploit supply. It will provoke higher prices, surely. The only question is, will the governments follow through? And will the demand for these critical minerals be insulated by the commitments, or will they fall flat on their face? We taking a politician's word for it is not the most wise thing to do, but they've really pushed for this green energy transition. They've invested already a lot of sunk costs into it. And to turn back now would be such a waste of taxpayers' money. I think we have to see it through.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, it's the right thing that we're going to have to do. But we have to stop making these unrealistic expectations. As we've gone through this process of examining just the transportation industry and the infrastructure, it's become self-evident that the messaging that all you got to do is buy an electric car and the planet's problems are solved is far too simplistic a response to some of the challenges that we're facing. We barely touched the surface of this subject, and we've seen where the ripples have already gone out and into the mining sphere. On how much more needs to be mined in order to services the need of the idyllic green infrastructure. And I'm in agreement with you, and it's going to be old and new energy that's going to be fueling the increases. But, we haven't even talked the other things such as labor. We don't have enough people in the mining industry. If we were to snap our fingers tomorrow and mysteriously built all the mines that we needed to have the ore to build this infrastructure and the cars, we don't have the people to work in the mines because they aren't trained and there's not enough of them.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about, especially for metals, the niche, kind of like tin. I recently wrote an article about tin. The lack of geological expertise in that industry has resulted in an absolute scarcity of tin deposits. I mean, you've got Alphamin in Congo that came online a few years ago, which is responsible for about 3% of total tin production. But aside from that, there's been very, very few tin deposits. And as a result, there's going to be probably a supply crunch for metals like tin. And it's relatively the same across the board for whether you're talking about rare earths, whether you're talking about silver and copper. And then you talk about lead times as well. We're talking 10 to 15-year lead times from inception to actual production.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky. And obviously declining grades at the same time as well as the quality of deposits decrease. So it's a great time to be considering investments in the natural resource sector purely because of this fundamental supply-demand imbalance that is so pervasive. And it presents a much more compelling opportunity, in my opinion, than these, pardon my French, shit coins that we see in the crypto sphere that we discussed about in New Orleans.
You mean like Doge?
Well, there's that. There's Doge. There's all sorts. There's I forget what our good friend Dan was telling us about. Something to do with a cat. I mean, these are completely coins or assets. I don't even want to call them assets with no intrinsic value, and it makes me cringe and it makes me wince. And I think people should consider more value-driven investments, deep value, and take a look at the natural resource sector because there are a lot of bargains at the moment, a lot of great companies who are going to benefit in the years to come.
Yeah, no, I'm in full agreement. My biggest concern is this is a Herculean task, and that we're not electing leaders that are up to the task is my biggest fear. As we kind of jumped a little bit on the Trump presidency, but I'm not sure if Kamala Harris had been the president, it had been much better. I don't think our politicians have a clear enough understanding of the challenges ahead just to do this. They think that it's a simple snap of the finger and the solar panels appear and the cars become electric and everyone starts riding a bicycle and walking and I just don't think that they get it.
No, and I think hopefully with Trump and Musk, we have a bit more realism. As crazy as that is to say, with someone like Trump. I mean, the thing is, I think it was on their X Spaces call that they did a few weeks ago, when basically Musk endorsed Trump, and Musk was basically saying that as the CEO of an EV manufacturer, the intended pace of this transition is way too fast. He called it BS. He said, we're never going to get there that quickly. And you're talking about a guy who has the incentive to try and, campaign for a faster transition because that would benefit him and Tesla shareholders. So it's reassuring to see that there's an added dose of realism back in the US for the green energy transition. But it's so important to remember that it's still going to happen. It's just not going to happen as quickly as organizations such as the IEA allude to.
Yeah, but the other concern to that coin is those that are opposed say, "See, told you so," and that's the other side that you can still get pushback on, and it's certainly going to be interesting times as we go forward from here. But I want to thank you for your time. Those are 4 really good articles, folks. Go through our last 4 issues. They were the cover stories: planes, trains, automobiles, and then this cover, infrastructure. People want to follow your work, Ted. I understand you're online.
I am, yes. You can find me at Ted J. Butler on LinkedIn and also on the website, tedjbutler.com. You can check me out there and send me a message on LinkedIn if you have any questions.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to your next article in our January issue. And it's been good coming across the pond to where you are.
Absolutely. And I hope to see you again, perhaps in January or March in your own country, in Canada.
Yeah, well, maybe we could take you to a hockey game and get you over that silly soccer sport you guys like over here.
Well, we'll see. We've got football tonight with Manchester United, so I'll see if you can catch the first 10 minutes of that without cringing and running away.
Yeah, well, I've been having trouble sleeping, and maybe not after that.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Ted. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.